Yesterday, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood outside a cabinet meeting in Ottawa and flatly contradicted the United States Treasury Secretary regarding a private telephone call with Donald Trump. This sudden breakdown in basic diplomatic consensus reveals a much larger conflict over trade leverage and national sovereignty. When two G7 governments cannot agree on what was literally spoken during a 15-minute conversation, the dispute is no longer about communication errors. This is a deliberate battle to control the narrative of power and economic dependency between the world's largest trading partners. That public standoff is the direct result of a sequence that began exactly 1 week earlier at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. In January, the Canadian Prime Minister delivered an address outlining how great powers weaponize supply chains and bilateral negotiations against smaller states. Exactly 24 hours later, the United States President took the same stage to remind the audience that roughly 75% of Canada's total exports flow directly into the American market, explicitly stating that Canada lives because of the United States. The subsequent telephone call on Monday was meant to manage the fallout, but the resulting public descriptions have instead exposed a deep structural fracture. White House Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that Carney was aggressively walking back his remarks, a claim Carney rejected the following morning with a single, definitive word. That rapid escalation of public friction demonstrates how deeply the bilateral relationship has shifted from quiet diplomacy to overt perception management. When a Treasury Secretary uses highly loaded terms on camera from the Oval Office, the phrase is chosen specifically to signal to global markets that middle power resistance evaporates under direct pressure. For international investors, that American narrative carries real financial consequence because it implies that Canada's domestic economic policy remains structurally subordinate to Washington's demands. Carney's immediate, double-repeated denial in an Ottawa hallway was a calculated defensive countermeasure to protect his state's future negotiating position. That swift rejection shows that the Canadian administration calculated the domestic political cost of appearing to capitulate was far higher than the diplomatic risk of directly challenging the integrity of a senior American official. This friction is occurring against the backdrop of critical economic deadlines, specifically the upcoming formal review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Roughly 75% of Canada's export economy depends entirely on this single, tariff-free framework, which is already facing severe structural revision. Washington has signaled a preference for shifting the agreement toward unstable annual reviews rather than a standard long-term renewal, a change that has already generated a measurable chill in long-term corporate investment commitments across Canadian industries. What that structural uncertainty does is grant the American administration permanent economic leverage over Ottawa's domestic policy choices. By forcing annual adjustments, Washington ensures that Canadian trade policy remains in a state of perpetual compliance, in direct response to that vulnerability. The Canadian government has initiated an ambitious strategic pivot to double its non-United States exports within the next decade. This goal represents a fundamental restructuring of national economic dependency away from the American market. The strategic logic dictating this shift is clear. A middle power can only earn the right to take independent foreign policy positions when it reduces its structural vulnerability to foreign economic retaliation. That objective explains why the Canadian Prime Minister has executed 9 separate diplomatic trips to Europe in just 15 months. Focusing heavily on trade diversification with partners like Ireland. Each cross-border agreement signed outside the North American orbit is a deliberate attempt to dilute the coercive weight of the single market dependency. The United States administration, conversely, continues to exploit this asymmetry through both rhetorical threats and concrete regulatory pressure. Washington has repeatedly floated the prospect of 35% tariffs on Canadian manufacturing, alongside warnings regarding critical bilateral infrastructure linkages. Every such statement reinforces the exact dynamic of economic coercion that the Canadian administration criticized on the stage in Switzerland. If the American administration genuinely believes that public pressure successfully forces policy concessions, it will continue to increase the severity of its demands. The dispute over the content of the phone call is therefore a reliable barometer for how effectively a smaller, dependent economy can resist the strategic weight of a neighboring hegemon. Ultimately, both leaders are performing for two distinct audiences simultaneously, balancing domestic political survival against international negotiating leverage. For the United States, the narrative of a submissive trading partner satisfies a domestic political base that demands an America-first approach to global commerce. For Canada, a posture of rigid independence is essential for a prime minister who secured party leadership on a specific promise to confront bilateral bullying. This divergence means that the actual text of the phone call matters less than the irreconcilable narratives each government has chosen to construct around it. But the more consequential question, the one that cross-border logistics networks and industrial manufacturers are tracking with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. The public clash over a single phone call exposes a severe narrative divide between Washington and Ottawa, transforming a standard diplomatic exchange into a highly calculated test of statecraft. On one side, the United States Treasury claims an immediate capitulation, while on the other, the Canadian Prime Minister insists on an unyielding defense of his sovereign posture. That baseline contradiction is not a mere product of miscommunication, but rather a deliberate deployment of conflicting strategic narratives designed to influence global markets and national political bases ahead of major economic negotiations. To understand the true intent driving this high-stakes dispute, one must analyze the precise data points, regulatory deadlines, and economic maneuvers occurring beyond the immediate political theater. The primary leverage point in this confrontation is the upcoming formal review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, a trade framework that dictates the flow of billions of dollars in cross-border commerce. Under the current legislative rules, the agreement faces a mandatory joint review that allows any participating nation to introduce sweeping tariff adjustments or terminate the pact altogether. That legal vulnerability gives the American administration a potent mechanism to enforce policy compliance on its northern neighbor. For Canada, which relies on the United States for the purchase of 3/4 of its total outbound commodities, any disruption to this framework threatens immediate domestic industrial paralysis. newsonair.gov.n, Nisho 1. The deliberate timing of the American rhetoric reveals a strategy aimed at exploiting this exact trade vulnerability to suppress Canadian autonomy before formal text negotiations even begin. Following the exchange in Switzerland, United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent directly explicitly linked the political dispute to the upcoming trade review on major financial networks. Bessent stated on television, "I would not pick a fight going into USMCA to score some cheap political points." What that response reveals is a deliberate choice to convert a symbolic dispute into a tangible threat of economic costs for the Canadian economy. By framing the Prime Minister's speech as an expensive political error, the Treasury Department signaled that compliance during the trade review is the mandatory price for maintaining tariff exemptions. newsonair.gov.n Show 1. This warning directly corresponds to a broader American strategy of manufacturing structural uncertainty to chill long-term capital investments within competing jurisdictions. Throughout the past 15 months, Washington has repeatedly utilized sudden tariff threats and alternative legislative proposals, such as shifts toward annual trade reviews, to disrupt predictable corporate planning. That state-level instability forces international corporations to hesitate before allocating capital to Canadian manufacturing plants, effectively redirecting corporate investment back into the United States market. The immediate consequence of this policy is an artificial reduction in Canada's domestic industrial competitiveness, demonstrating that rhetorical pressure can achieve concrete protectionist outcomes without introducing new legislation to neutralize this asymmetric vulnerability. The Canadian administration has responded with an aggressive, long-term strategy of rapid geographical diversification. the Prime Minister's rapid sequence of 9 separate European diplomatic missions within 15 months is a direct attempt to construct alternative corporate supply lines away from North America. That diplomatic pace is explicitly designed to expand trade volumes with the European Union and specific gateway nations like Ireland, diluting the structural leverage currently wielded by Washington. By establishing alternative destinations for Canadian commodities, Ottawa is attempting to build a material cushion that will allow its negotiators to reject coercive terms during future trade rounds. However, the domestic political reality within Canada complicates this long-term economic pivot, forcing the administration into an immediate posture of public defiance. Public polling indicates that the Canadian electorate is deeply hostile toward any appearance of national capitulation to foreign demands, meaning that a submissive stance would trigger an immediate domestic political crisis for the ruling party. This reality explains why the Prime Minister chose to issue an immediate, absolute denial of the American narrative outside the cabinet meeting in Ottawa. He calculated that the short-term risk of irritating the White House was significantly lower than the long-term domestic penalty of appearing weak before the Canadian public. At the exact same time, the United States administration is utilizing this bilateral friction to reinforce its own domestic political message of absolute economic dominance. The White House narrative that the Canadian leader aggressively folded during the private phone call perfectly validates a domestic political doctrine that asserts aggressive bilateral pressure always yields immediate foreign concessions. That strategic framing ensures that, regardless of the actual, private nuances spoken during the 15-minute call, the public perception of unyielding American leverage remains fully intact for voters and legislators in Washington. This means the conflict is fundamentally an exercise in parallel perception management, where both capitals prioritize domestic narrative control over bilateral diplomatic stability. The true efficacy of these competing strategies will not be determined by public statements, but by a highly specific regulatory event scheduled for later this year. The formal launch of the Trilateral Trade Review will force both nations to translate their rhetorical positions into binding legal text, revealing whether Canada's quiet diversification has generated true leverage, or if Washington's economic gravity will compel absolute concession. The immediate focus now narrows to the specific industrial sectors, such as automotive manufacturing and energy supply chains, where cross-border integration is deepest and most sensitive to tariff adjustments. But the more consequential question, the one that central banks and multinational boards are watching with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. Synthesizing this intense narrative friction reveals that the diplomatic dispute between Washington and Ottawa is not an isolated rhetorical disagreement, but rather the visible manifestation of a permanent structural realignment in North American trade. The conflicting accounts offered by the United States Treasury and the Canadian Prime Minister illustrate a deeper clash between two irreconcilable models of regional power. While the immediate political focus remains fixed on the specific details of a single 15-minute telephone conversation, the broader economic data demonstrates that both nations are actively executing long-term strategies designed to permanently alter their baseline vulnerabilities. For international markets, corporate boards, and neighboring mid-tier economies, this standoff signals the end of predictable trilateral consensus and the beginning of a highly transaction-driven era of bilateral brinkmanship. For Canada, the strategic shift requires a rapid transition from rhetorical defiance to a concrete, material insulation of its domestic market. The stated national objective to double non-United States exports within the next decade represents a highly complex structural intervention that cannot be achieved through routine trade promotion alone. To dilute a 75% export dependency on a single neighboring hegemon, Ottawa must successfully redirect massive volumes of industrial output toward alternative global consumers. This aggressive diversification strategy demands sustained capital deployment into specialized transport logistics, maritime shipping infrastructure, and target market regulatory alignments over multiple fiscal cycles. The immediate consequence for Canadian domestic policy is a mandatory multi-year reallocation of state resources toward international economic defense. For the United States, the strategy represents a deliberate validation of protectionist leverage as a permanent tool of foreign economic policy. By maintaining a narrative of absolute dominance and threatening highly disruptive 35% tariffs, Washington successfully establishes a perpetual compliance mechanism over dependent trading partners. This aggressive posture forces foreign governments to constantly modify their domestic regulations and state-level investments to avoid sudden, punitive market exclusions. The broader systemic effect of this American approach is the deliberate fragmentation of established global supply chains, replacing stable multilateral legal frameworks with volatile, short-term bilateral concessions. Consequently, Washington ensures that the massive gravity of the United States consumer market remains an active, weaponized instrument of statecraft. This regional friction is causing significant ripple effects across major global economic centers, forcing partners in Europe and Asia to rapidly recalibrate their own supply chain dependencies. The Canadian administration's intensive diplomatic campaign, including 9 distinct ministerial visits to European capitals like Dublin and Paris, demonstrates how middle powers are actively seeking safety in numbers. European economies, similarly exposed to sudden shifts in American trade policy, view these overtures as a strategic opportunity to secure stable alternative access to critical North American natural resources and energy supplies. Simultaneously, major Asian manufacturing centers, notably India, are closely monitoring this cross-border dynamic as a template for navigating increasingly aggressive bilateral demands from the Western Hemisphere. The result is a global network of middle powers quietly constructing defensive economic coalitions to mitigate their collective vulnerability to unilateral great power coercion. The immediate trajectory of this conflict will be determined by the specific terms established during the formal launch of the trade review later this year. If the United States successfully imposes an unstable system of annual regulatory updates, it will secure permanent, structural leverage capable of freezing long-term industrial investment outside its borders. Conversely, if Canada manages to leverage its accelerating European partnerships and defense sector commitments to secure a stable, multi-year renewal, it will demonstrate that an integrated middle power can successfully resist intense bilateral pressure. This impending legal confrontation ensures that the rhetorical skirmishes witnessed on the international stage will rapidly transform into highly specific, binding text negotiations where every line dictates the flow of billions of dollars in industrial capital. The single most important takeaway from this entire diplomatic confrontation is that in the modern international order, economic integration has been completely inverted from a guarantee of regional stability into a highly potent vulnerability to be systematically exploited. Great powers no longer view deeply interconnected cross-border supply chains as a mutual benefit to be preserved, but rather as direct channels of leverage designed to enforce political and regulatory subordination. For a dependent middle power, nominal sovereignty remains functionally hollow unless it is backed by a highly diversified, materially resilient domestic economy that can withstand the sudden imposition of state-level trade restrictions. Ultimately, nations can no longer separate their foreign policy principles from their